Okay, so moving on to the first of the integrated theories now. We're going to look at Marshall and Barbaree's integrated theory of child sexual offending. This is a comprehensive theory, so what that means is it brings in a range of different areas of psychology. So thinking back to the Finkelhor model, it was not necessarily kind of clear where the psychology was in that model. It's a very process-driven approach. With the Marshall and Barbaree approach, the model does have lots of psychology, bringing different angles and different perspectives into the kind of process of understanding sexual offending, particularly in relation to adolescent offending. Now, some of those aspects of psychology are developmental experiences, biological processes, kind of the social psychology of understanding cultural norms, but also understanding psychological vulnerabilities in terms of problem solving and emotion regulation and things like that. So just to give you an overview of what the model looks like, it begins with the idea that an individual, typically someone who is an adolescent, may have faced adverse childhood or developmental experiences. If we think back to the Cambridge study and Moffat's work on the life course theory in relation to delinquency, we're thinking about things like poor attachments. We're thinking about not having supervision in the home. We're thinking about maybe neglect at a young age, not necessarily learning those socially acceptable models almost of how you act in the social world. Now what that leads to is an interpersonal or emotion regulation deficit. So if you've not been able to form attachments in your childhood, thinking about the internal working model perhaps, you don't necessarily learn how to soothe yourself in an effective way in terms of managing your emotions. You don't learn how to interact with other people, maybe without acting out in an aggressive way to start with, if you're particularly maybe avoidantly attached or disorganizedly attached. So these kind of adverse experiences set a template for how people interact with people in a very general sense. We're not talking about sexual interactions here, we're talking about just general emotion regulation and interpersonal skills. Now, obviously at a certain point in time, an individual, typically we're talking about boys here, have this kind of onset of puberty, this rush of hormones that we might refer to as the sexual awakening. Now what that means is they start to realise that they are sexually aroused or sexually attracted to typically members of the opposite sex. And with that, they start to seek out opportunities for sexual outlet or sexual interactions. We're not necessarily talking about sexual intercourse, but we're talking about maybe forming relationships or beginning to form relationships with the targets of their sexual arousal. Now, when you couple that onset of puberty with poor emotion regulation and poor interpersonal skills, almost inevitably, as someone who is going into this sexual arena for the first time, you are likely to face some kind of rejection. What that could do, or according to this model, what that does is lead to the development of deviant sexual fantasies and deviant sexual interests. So, for example, if someone here begins to go through puberty, they have these sexual urges, these sexual attractions, and then they get rejected because they can't form a relationship in an effective way. At this point of the model, they might start to develop deviant sexual fantasies that involve coercion, potentially. So instead of forming a relationship in a pro-social way, they'll do it in an anti-social way. Or they'll start to develop feelings or thoughts that are congruent with that kind of view. Now, obviously, as kind of people who are going through this sexual awakening, they may start to rehearse those deviant sexual scripts or deviant sexual fantasies through masturbation. And the point here is that through that rehearsal, they start to reinforce the sexual deviancy, the sexual arousal, the sexual fantasy towards maybe beastophilic themes, so themes around forced or coerced sexual interactions. And then the kind of culmination of the model is that a sexual offence takes place once maybe that sexual fantasy isn't enough to sexually satisfy the individual. It's at this point here where we see the importance of understanding those level 3 theories. So understanding how it is that someone gets from a deviant sexual fantasy to enacting a sexual offence or to committing a sexual offence. These models are not clear in exactly the way that this happens, precisely because they are individual kind of level 3 processes for each individual perpetrator of sexual violence. So a lot of these theories may look like they're making a leap from fantasy to behaviour, for example, particularly at the end of the offence chain. And that's where those level 3 theories really start to become more important. Just to highlight some of the key points then of this integrated theory, these early developmental experiences are really vital, not necessarily in terms of sexual offending, but in terms of teaching us how to form and maintain effective interpersonal relationships. Now, a distortion of the internal working model through a lack of attachment or through a lack of developing interpersonal skills has an impact on how well we can form relationships going forward, or how we interpret other people's behaviour. That then potentially leads to an inability to cope when inevitable rejection occurs, particularly in early adolescence when that sexual awakening first happens. And then from there you start to maybe see that development of maladaptive sexual schemas, so forming schemas that are leading to a template for maybe sexual aggression. So what this theory does really nicely is bring in biological changes in terms of hormones and that kind of rush of hormones at the beginning of puberty, and link it to the social environment in terms of what that means in terms of the salience of sexual cues and what that means in terms of the rehearsal of sexual fantasy. So at the core of this, emotion regulation becomes sexualized, and this is a really important theme in a lot of particularly emergent sexual interests. So any kind of literature that you read around maybe problematic sexual arousal has this kind of element of sex becoming a coping mechanism, and the idea that sex serves this kind of regulatory process in terms of emotion regulation and interpersonal regulation becomes important, not necessarily in the onset of sexual offending, but certainly in the maintenance of it. If committing a sexual offence alleviates a feeling of negative emotional arousal, then it's more likely to become kind of self-fulfilling and self-perpetuating as a cycle. As a critique, the model does offer a really strong fusion of biological psychology, developmental psychology, clinical psychology, emotional psychology, but also a situational account of how these things happen, particularly in adolescence. So it really does explain adolescent offending, particularly the onset of adolescent offending, quite well. Now, that said, it doesn't explain why people from high status backgrounds or people who do have secure attachments may commit a sexual offence. It's quite deterministic in that sense, in that it assumes that a low level of attachment or a poor attachment style, an insecure attachment style, is likely to lead to all of these downstream effects. It's quite deterministic, quite fatalistic, and that would be something that I'd really kind of urge you to think about when you're trying to apply this kind of model. But hopefully you can see how different aspects of psychology are beginning to come into some of these models to help us get a kind of comprehensive view as to how we can properly understand the range of different factors that lead someone to commit a sexual offence.